Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I just came from an appropriations subcommittee hearing, and our witness today was Secretary Janet Yellen. And I always love when Secretary Yellen testifies because I learned so much from her. Today, among other subjects, we talked about the President's proposed budget. And I want to tell you some of the things I learned today from Secretary Yellen about the President's proposed budget. The President's proposed budget is $6.9 trillion. That's up from $6.4 trillion. So it's a proposed $500 billion increase. I learned that since 2019 until today, and not including the President's new spending, I learned that since 2019 until today, the population in the United States has grown 1.8%. You know how much our budget has increased? 55%. And that doesn't even count the additional $500 billion worth of spending that the President has just proposed. I also learned that the President is proposing $4.7 trillion, not billion, $4.7 trillion in new taxes. Takes my breath away. $4.7 trillion. We're going to run out of digits. And I also learned something else. You know, the President, and I say this gently and with respect, the President has been running all over hell and half of Georgia saying my proposed budget decreases the deficit by $3 trillion. You probably heard him say that. I heard him say it day before yesterday. My proposed budget will cut debt by $3 trillion. You know what I learned today about the President's proposed budget? Under his proposed budget, gross debt, that's all of America's debt, not just debt held by the public, but gross debt, all of our debt will rise under President Biden's budget from $32.7 trillion at the close of this year to $51 trillion by 2033. Only in Washington, D.C., only in La La Land can you go around and say, my budget reduces the deficit and debt by $3 trillion when it really increases it by $18 trillion. $18 trillion. I've also learned a lot this week about Silicon Valley Bank. I think I spoke, Mr. President, I don't know, a week, maybe 10 days ago. Gosh, we've learned a lot in a week. One of the things that we have learned is that the failure of Silicon Valley Bank and President Biden's bailout of Silicon Valley Bank was the result of bad management by the bank officials, but also by bad supervision. I talked about a week or two ago about the risk that the management of SVB Bank took. But today, this is what I learned this week. I want to talk about the mistakes that were made by the federal government in supervising this bank. Fact number one. It is a fact that in January of 2019, the Federal Reserve, which is one of the banking regulators in charge of supervising the bank, issued a warning to the bank This is 4 years ago, over its risk management systems. 4 years ago, the Fed told Silicon Valley Bank that its system to control risk was not up to snuff. Fact number 2. Last fall, short sellers and private bank analysts said the same thing. What, 5 months ago? 6 months ago? Fact number 3. Some of my colleagues have said, you know, we didn't have sufficient regulation. I don't know how you regulate greed. I don't know how you regulate stupidity, but I'm referring now to the management of Silicon Valley Bank. But it wasn't a failure of regulation that caused Silicon Valley Bank to go under. It was the failure to enforce the rules that we already have. I just explained to you, here's the article from the Wall Street Journal. The Federal Reserve, one of the banking regulators in charge of Silicon Valley Bank, knew in January of 2019, the bank was criticized for its risk control practices. And they were supposed to correct those risk control practices. Why didn't the Federal Reserve follow up? Now, I also learned, some of my colleagues are saying, well, you know, this is all the fault of Congress. It's the fault of Congress because Silicon Valley Bank was not subject to a stress test. We, as you know, Democrats and Republicans supported an amendment to Dodd-Frank back in 2018 that some say prevented the bank from being stress tested. That's not true. The bill that we passed in 2018 said categorically and unequivocally, look at Title 12, Chapter 2, Subchapter A, Part 252, Subpart A, Section 252.3. It said in our legislation that the Federal Reserve and the other banking regulators had the authority at any time to stress test Silicon Valley Bank, and they chose not to do it. Now, the other point being made by some of my colleagues is that, well, they weren't big enough to stress test. They had to be $100 billion or more. That's not true. They were over a $100 billion bank at the end of 2021. So they did qualify to be stress tested in 2022. One of the other things we've learned, Mr. President, is that in 2022, the Federal Reserve stress tested 34 banks. Silicon Valley Bank was not one of them, as I said. They could have been. Under the rules, they qualified. They were supposed to be. They were over $100 billion. And even had they not been over $100 billion, the Federal Reserve could have said, we're going to stress test them anyway under our legislation. Because back in February or January of 2019, we were worried about their risk control. But for whatever reason, we're going to find out the Federal Reserve chose not to stress test them. The Federal Reserve issued a report on its stress tests from 2022. Here it is. If the Federal Reserve had stress tested Silicon Valley Bank, Silicon Valley Bank would have passed. It would have passed. You know why? Because the Federal Reserve, in its stress testing in 2022, didn't stress test interest rate risk. They just stress tested credit risk. I just find that extraordinary. In 2022, we were experiencing raging inflation. The Fed was raising interest rates. The Fed understands that when you hold a long government bond or a long treasury, that its value decreases as interest rates go up. You would think that the first thing the Federal Reserve would stress test for was interest rate risk and duration risk. But it didn't. It didn't, and I am at a loss to understand. Mr. President, now the Federal Reserve has announced, I think the Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Mr. Barr, has announced that he's going to be in charge of finding out what went wrong. And Mr. Barr's a fine person, and nothing I say today should be construed to suggest that he's not. But Mr. Barr has a conflict of interest. His own agency contributed to the downfall of Silicon Valley Bank. It wasn't a question of something that Congress did or didn't do. Under the regulations we passed, we put the Federal Reserve in charge of checking these banks for duration or interest rate risk. And the Federal Reserve chose not to do so. Now, Silicon Valley Bank is not the only one out there. And here's the problem with Silicon Valley Bank. It took in a whole bunch of deposits from a bunch of venture capitalists and paid them, let's call it a X amount of interest. And then Silicon Valley Bank took that money and invested the money in long-term government bonds and treasuries, as the Federal Reserve encouraged them to. Go read all the Federal Reserve rules. They tell you the safest assets, if you're a bank, you can own are long-term securities held by, are issued by the federal government, treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. So Silicon Valley Bank did that. But as the Federal Reserve is also supposed to know, as is the management of the bank, these long-term bonds, government or otherwise, as interest rates rise, they fall in value. I mean, that's like banking 101. That's like econ 101. And that's what happened to Silicon Valley Bank. They took all the deposits, paid X amount of interest, and bought treasuries and long-term government bonds, making more interest. They were taking the profit, but they didn't account for interest rate risk. And sure enough, when the Federal Reserve, which is supposed to be supervising the bank, raised interest rates, the value of those bonds and the value of those treasuries went down. And so when all these depositors in Silicon Valley decided to take their money out, they panicked. They all started talking to each other on social media, and they started taking their money out because of the decrease in the value of those long treasuries and government-backed mortgage-backed securities. Silicon Valley Bank didn't have the money to pay them. Let me end like I began. President Biden's bailout was necessitated by two things: the greed and/or the stupidity of the management of this bank to buy long-term bonds, government-backed or otherwise, and not hedge against its interest rate risk. And number two, the bank's failure was a result of inadequate supervision by the Federal Reserve and the other banking regulators in the Biden administration. Congress had nothing to do with it. Our amendments to Dodd-Frank, which were approved by both Republicans and Democrats, had nothing to do with it. Thank you, Mr. President. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.